You're doing a thing first.
That's okay.
Thank you.
Oh my, fancy.
We're also making sure, yes, to. All right.
Is
so-
this part going to be on YouTube?
Yes, we are on YouTube right now.
Oh, we're on YouTube right now.
We're simulcasting right now.
Hello, internet.
And it's correct mic on right now.
I think my mic is on. Oh, you're right. I forgot to turn it. Oh yeah, the light's on. Yeah. So let's. Yes.
Yeah.
And over here, and then walk.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Jersey's gonna do something at the beginning, then I'll come up, I'll do the sponsor thing. Yeah.
All good. Takes a little bit of pressure off of making it to that time point. I know. It'd be rough because I'm at like 36 slides.
Yeah.
I think so, are we almost?
We're at 2 minutes.
All right.
It's 2 minutes, everybody, and we're gonna start. Giving you a chance to settle in, get comfortable. Everybody on the internet and everybody in this room.
All right.
Thanks you guys for this very strange.
Yeah, people are cool. I like people.
Yeah. No, I went by campus like at college because there was so many campus. But then with teaching children, like 5 to 10-year-olds, I weird name I could. Yeah, so.
That's okay. Yeah, no, this is something that came up during the retreat. And we're just like, they're like, so seeing the Campbell, I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, I'm clearly having an identity crisis. I don't know how to approach this. I like my name.
All right, it is time. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cartoon Crossroads Columbus 2021. Both live here in Columbus, Ohio at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum and on the internet. Can the people in the room please make a little bit of noise? Look, Best applause. My name is CXC Talk Teach, and I am the interim executive director of Cartoon Crossroads Columbus.org. For those of you who are watching on the internet, and you're like, what's going on this weekend? I heard that there's a thing happening. Yes, there are physical events, in-person events happening here in Columbus this weekend. But also, if you go to our website, cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org, and hover over that schedule tab, you can see that the schedule is sorted into these convenient buckets where there's virtual content, there's stuff happening on our Discord, which you can get to at cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org/Discord. And then also, yes, here in Columbus at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum. Thank you, everybody who came out today in person. Thanks to everybody who's watching on the internet. And now I'm going to hand it off to Caitlin McGurk of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum.
Hi, everyone here at the Billy Ireland. Hello, everyone in TV land, waving at the cameras. This is so strange. I'm Caitlin McGurk. I'm an associate curator and associate professor here at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum. We are always so happy to be partnering with CXC, and to be actually here in person is really special for us. I'm just going to go over some sponsor thanks and a land acknowledgement before we get into our first program. CXC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our annual festival, which is free to the public, relies on corporate and grant support, as well as individual donations. We're grateful for these supports. We visit the support CXC link on our website to find out how you can help us create meaningful connections between the people who make comics and those who read them. Cartoon Crossroads Columbus acknowledges that the ancient ancestors of the Eastern Woodlands tribes, now referred to as the Adita and Hopewell cultures, inhabited the land we know as Ohio. Their descendants include the living nations of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandot, Delaware, and Seneca Cayuga. We honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this place where we gather. We hope you enjoy this event. Don't forget to visit our virtual expo at cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org and keep the conversation going in our Discord channel, which you can find at cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org/Discord. All right, now to intro our very first presenter. C.M. Campbell received his BA in Fine Art with a studio emphasis at San Francisco State University and his MFA in comics at California College of the Arts. He grew up in Evanston, Illinois, and currently resides in Columbus, Ohio, where he professes about comics at Columbus College of Art and Design. His work as a comic artist can be most prominently found in editorial cartooning, with publications like Hyperallergic and The Margins. His most recent comic in print, That Old English, came out this summer and can be purchased following this talk. Welcome, CM.
I love the word professed. I've never said that I professed anything. And I realize that like I do, I profess a lot. That's my thing. Some people call me a professor. So thank you for having me here. I do appreciate it. Today, I just wanted to, with the invitation to come here, I got a chance to really kind of select what I feel needed to be discussed or that I thought would be really fun to discuss. And I chose one of the, I imagine, most upfront, kind of basic, somewhat seemingly boring topics, and have clearly chosen a layout in the gray to emphasize that. But I wanted to really emphasize some of the value of basic page layout and how to really navigate that space really effectively. And I think that this should be helpful for anybody stepping into comics today. I wanted to first talk about the complexity of comics and the deep, deep details that one might go through to tell a beautiful story through a layout that isn't all, squares and rectangles. So even when I examine something like J.H. Williams' Batwoman, I can see this come together as a singular visual composition that is really effective when I just look at it as a whole. There is a dynamicism to it. There's some symmetry. There is just an excellent choice of color, but there is an element that is critical to comics that this actually does an immensely good job doing, which is storytelling and kind of compounding certain aesthetics and certain storytelling devices to create something that feels fresh and new. With that in mind, how I understand like details surrounding the comic language and art language as a whole, it lends itself to a language that we all kind of naturally speak and orient ourselves. Whether it's going from left to right in relation to the literature, or if it's looking at a series of images that are compounded, that is reminiscent of Marcel Duchamp's Descending the Stairway. We can see that there is a language that has been built up over the years that communicate ideas. Now, in order to get to the root of that, we have to break down those bits of language and kind of figure out where the punctuation is. One place that I found it's really great to see how basic structures and gridded panels can lead to really complex storytelling is Watchmen. Even taking an examination on how one could take a basic 3x3 nine panel grid and do really complex and intricate presentations, both in storytelling, here looking at a moment-to-moment transition with this kind of with the framing pulling back from a one-point perspective looking down into the gutters and leading to this vertical landscape of the city. Shows how we can move forward a narrative and control pacing. But even on an aesthetic level, once you look at these pages laid out and see how the color and how the compositions and how the framing leads us through an entire story, you can see that there's not only this narrative function, which is still heavily retained, but there's also an aesthetic that is guiding us, whether it's through the use of shadows and the use of different values, all the way to the use of different hues and saturations to punctuate a moment. Even with the constraints of a grid, and in many ways, I'm going to address this notion of a page having constraints. We're able to tell something not only really effectively, but something that is beyond what we might consider as limited. So I wanted to talk about the function of the panel and the function of the page. So each panel is, that's fine. Each panel is a moment meant to carry the reader through a period of time. Before you begin to lay out a page, think about what needs to happen in that page.
the way I would approach that challenge is I often write a book in a notebook like this. Here, oh yeah, you can see me. And then I'll just have Post-its saying what needs to happen on page 1, what needs to happen on page 2. So each one of my pages will have a thesis. And so once I have that thesis, I know exactly where I begin and where I need to end. Oh, okay, cool. In film, you have windows of 1.5 to 2.5 hours of a full-length feature. In fine art, you may have a body of work or be limited to a single moment in a single piece of space. In comics printing standards, you have a basic, you have, we'll say an 8 to 10 pages if you're a short story, maybe longer. And maybe if I'm limiting you as an artist, you know, you could always say 1 panel on a splash page. But I tend to talk about it in terms of 3 to 10 panels in order to make sure that things are structured, especially at the script level. And then, of course, I want to account for compositions as I'm thinking about my page layouts. And this tends to be something I really want to emphasize is considering text as a part of your script. This is some notes written by Paul Murray about how one might approach writing a Disney comic. So this was floating around in-house. I always recommend everyone check this out, but this part felt like it rang to me and kind of sticks with me in terms of how one should consider organizing their text in their work. And then I also wanted to touch on the fact that we are limited in the amount of real estate that we have, and being able to navigate the amount of information that we give per panel is going to be a consideration that I have every time that I lay out my scripts, every time I lay out my pages. Which brings us, oh, and I'm going to primarily be focusing on square and rectangle panels in order to maintain a clear structure of my ideas, but we'll be able to see how this kind of translates to more intricate and angular composed panels. But this tends to be the space that I operate in my head. And I think this is as far as figuring out how to organize your thoughts in a page, I rather think about things in solid squares like, you know, like square states instead of Florida, you know? You have organic shapes and you have really solid shapes with clear like markers of how much space they're taking up. And then something that helps is understanding the 3 panels or 3-act structure. You might have a story function, and this is really punctuated in comic strips. You have the setup in your first panel, you have your conflict in your second panel, and you have your resolution in the third panel. And so you have this reflected in longer story arcs. You have 3-act plays, 3-act films, and understanding that you need to set up a narrative and establish a space before you disrupt that space. And then in order to conclude the story, have some type of resolution. I am not always a proponent of cliffhangers, but presumably for most stories, looking for a resolution is a really significant part of the storytelling process. But then take this over to a full page, and you can look at the tiers as a way of breaking up that 3-act structure. So notice on, this is V for Vendetta, written by Alan Moore. You introduce this character. Now, in the larger scope of this story, we already know who this character is, but just looking at this page, we take a moment and we introduce our character and we establish, where the character is. We get the information that we need off of these first 2 panels. And then in the second act, or the second tier, we show that there is a threat, we establish a relationship, and this is often reflected, this is my favorite moment in the second act of a comic strip, is when you have a second character show up and conflict with the first character. This is the Odie of this scenario. And then on the third act, you show resolution. And so this is where we have the inner voice of our main character, Miss Hammond, in the final panel, end where the page begins implying a loop. The end is punctuated and you feel a sense of closure in this ending, and you have this page that feels like a story in itself. But stepping back from that, let's look at different ways of approaching the number of panels one has on a page and what we could do with that space. I first wanted to take a look at, this is Darwin Cook on the left two, and you have Tim Sale on the right. There are two different approaches on the two right images. The right one, the farthest right, which is Tim Sale, you have a very cinematic framing, and you're given a lot of leeway and a lot of room in order to establish a space and develop a tone. This is also kind of rely on the reader's relationship with cinema by giving you a wider scope. But once you go over to the left, you have this moment-to-moment transition, framing a nice story. But look how we've compounded several stories in the landscape as well as the foreground. Both of these effects are equally combined in that far left, where you get to establish a space, have a foreground, middle ground, background that you are able to articulate a narrative through on the second panel, and on the third panel, a sense of conclusion. And so, in addition to this, you have some advantages surrounding how you're going to deal with text placement. There are two major advantages with 3 panels and text placement. One is the fact that you could kind of load up the text a little bit. You have a little bit more leeway in terms of text spacing, especially because you could divide up these panels in ways that imply, if you were to divide up that second panel into half, load the right side with text. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the most effective way of managing it, but it's something that is a little less out of place than it would be in another comic with less panels. But also, I really love the compounding of narratives. Specifically, this harkened back to kind of the approaches that Mad Magazine would do in terms of packing each panel with as many gags as you can. When you have a wider space with a foreground, middle ground, and background, and you have a story that you need to tell, you can treat the foreground, middle ground, and background as panels in themselves. And so different narratives are happening in different layers of your story. And you can follow secondary characters, tertiary characters, and this allows you a little space to get a little bit, incorporate some more intricate and storylines, maybe a little bit of subtext. One thing that I forgot to mention about text is also this is places where you can kind of guide the eye with word balloons in a way that you may not be able to with a 9-panel grid. That might leave you either with the top of your panel or your bottom of your panel, but with the 3-panel grid, you could kind of create a flow amongst your panel. I have some examples of that later on in some panelist grids. And the horizontal panels can be great for dramatic effect. One thing, they are great at implying direction, bringing you to the far left, far right. The motion in a longer panel can be great, but also you could punctuate the more cinematic elements of your story, doing more dramatic close-ups. And I find that this is a great place for acting to exist for your characters in these more cinematic panels. And pushing a vertical panel could help to create wider spaces and a sense of depth in your world. In addition to vertical movement and the way that the horizontal panels work, one of the things that I love seeing is being able to get a cut of a splash page and a singular motion and a series of events happening in here. At some point, I'm going to touch on an 8-panel grid by Grant Morrison and Frank Quietly, which does an excellent job at showing the elongated panel being used at its most effective. Now, one of my favorites is actually the 6 and 8-panel grid. I find this to be extremely useful. One thing, I feel like the shape recalls a lot of different square media. I think it recalls vinyl record consumption, and most recently, Instagram. I think that there is a visual language of composing in a square that's really effective. There is an advantage with longer panels if you're thinking about your text as a framing device, in which case you're still kind of left with this horizontal frame, which you could kind of see in this Carl Barks Donald Duck comic. But you still can make adjustments, either focusing in on the vertical divide better and shifting it left and right according to your needs in the story. if we look at this Paul Murray Mickey Mouse on the left, we can see that we can shift the center gutters to turn any panel into a square panel, to stretch out any horizontal panel, and create more diversity in your panel structures depending on how much text or visual information you're trying to convey. And this format, especially at the process of scripting, is very easy to convert into less panels. If you only need 5 panels or you want to incorporate an establishing frame image, you can do so by simply converting any block space into a single panel. You could cut through one of your gutters and create one title card. This 8-panel structure and 6-panel structure tends to be really flexible. And this brings me to the 9-panel grid. One of the things I do like about the 9-panel grid is because of the culture surrounding comics, especially its relationship with the Watchmen, the 9-panel grid is given this weight to it. This it has a history behind it of people doing interesting things with it. I find one of those things to be very reminiscent of that 3-act structure, that 3-panel structure, the ability to create a grid and continue to have a 3-panel rhythm that you're following. You can look at different elements of incorporating different breaks in a singular image, but you can see even in the harkening back to the Watchmen panel, having that final panel that presents a singular idea. But the 9-panel grid gets a lot of weight to it. Here, let me go to this next one. One of the biggest disadvantages to this grid is specifically the text. This is actually something that I think needs to heavily be considered when applying the 9-panel grid to your comics, is the fact that you have text that is kind of limited to the tops or the bottoms of your page, of your panels. In contrast to Emily Carroll, who has a tendency to not have standardized grids, there is a poetry and a freedom to the application of text that specifically serves a function of guiding your eye. Once you move over to the left where you have a 9-panel grid, suddenly the text doesn't seem to be as important in terms of guiding the viewer because the panels are operating as text in themselves. They operate left to right, top to bottom. And so you lose a little freedom in terms of text. There's still a lot of things you can do. And I'd also like to note, once you have that text loaded in there, you are left with something closer to a square to compose underneath it, depending on how much text you're willing to use. There's also just a great rhythm and pattern. I think the element of 3 really matters. This also has the advantage, and if you've seen this grid being used pretty regularly, the same advantages of being able to quickly drop a single gutter and creating a wider space in order to play with. As long as you're not overly committed to the grid, then you could create something that's kind of interesting and functional for your storytelling methodology. And then the splash page. I think the splash page is, when I think about the splash page, I actually harken back to some Silver Age superhero comics, because the amount of information that one could put into a single page is pretty astounding in terms of covering a narrative. And so you get a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to being able to create layers and the advantage of a 3-panel, a 3-tier, 3-panel comic. I find the biggest challenge of this space is the actual illustration challenges of creating a full composition that communicates clear ideas, establishes space, and is in this specific format. And it has to actively tell a story. I can't remember if I said this about the 3 panels, but one of the most difficult elements of that is the fact that you have to fill it. It's difficult to create something like this and have a singular image. Is it possible? Yes, or a singular figure. But there is an expectation for it to establish some type of creates some type of information, though you could use it to create a certain type of mood. The expectation surrounding a splash page seems to be higher than most because of the amount of real estate that this singular page takes. But you could also step into surrealism and explore different elements of the splash page, not necessarily focusing on literal physical space, but actively treating it as a collage and compounding the information that you want in a less literal way to great effect. But this is actually the part that I'm most excited about, specifically the 4-panel grid. I don't think enough people use this one. This could be used, I think it was used amazingly by Jason in order to just go moment to moment. And the space ended up creating this kind of mood that slowed everything down. The text didn't seem too heavy, but like it was composed very specifically in that narrative to serve an emotional function. But what I found to be extremely effective on a narrative level, especially if you're talking about having a limited page count, is Jack Kirby's application. Let me move this. Jack Kirby's application of the 4-panel grid into his comics to create montages of information that got a story moving along. Jack Kirby was famous for saying, well, he's famous for a lot of things, but actively not wanting to redraw the same thing over and over again. So this moment is something that would have been avoided by Jack Kirby. But something where you get to create a whole new composition every time. You get to tell a whole new story every time. Really using this 4-panel grid lended itself to Jack Kirby's ability to do these fantastic narrative covers, but also in those 4-panel grids, the amount of information that is conveyed both visually and through the text was able to get a comic's worth of information into a single page. You were able to get 20 years of mythology from fourth world narratives into a single page so that the progress of the story continued to move forward. And these compositions tended to have a dynamicism that one thing, and I think I've yet to mention this, but this is really good. Being able to see the feet of your characters is really important. Having full body images, being able to have a full visual landscape. And look at the tilt on the top far left of the Jimmy Olsen comic, the first panel that we can view on the top left. Being able to tilt the image over and get the entire sense of a space in a room. All of these things can be accomplished by creating images in these 4-panel grids really effectively. I feel like I could pull each one of these and make these a cover. So use them more, internet. And this is, as a professor of comics, receiving a 12-panel script makes me want to explode. When I received that page and it has 12 panels on it, it does something to me. But there is, of course, effective ways of managing a 12-panel script. One thing, being cautious about the text. I'm hoping that every time I say the word text, something clicks with everybody. But managing the amount of text in relationship to the images that you have present allow for you to tell a more effective story. And with a 12-panel comic, looking at things like rhythm, creating beats, using very up-close framing of close-ups of hands, faces, incorporating moment-to-moment transitions in order to heighten single points to create a rhythm. At a 12-panel page, it is at its most effective where dialogue is minimal and the visuals are really taking reign. Thinking about the limitations of the 9-panel grid, those are doubled once you get to a 12-panel comic. I just had to count it again. Sometimes I forget myself. And so even once you step over there on the far left one is 12 plus an extra 4, it's 16 panels on the left side. You can see as those panels contract and get smaller, suddenly the pacing of that story seems to get faster and you're cutting through memories. But really heighten, focus in on action. Don't focus too heavily on text, and you'll find yourself doing really amazing dramatic work with these this quantity of panels. And of course, you can see this in works like Chris Ware. I do want to highlight that the print size and the specs certainly allow one a certain degree of freedom that one might not have in your standard 11 by 17. But there are new ways of approaching certain challenges. If you're talking about the compression of text, giving the text their own panels, rather than trying to squeeze the text into the same panels as these smaller images would be helpful in terms of composition, but also finding little moments to breathe and allow for the composition to work. Being able to compress this. You can see how one can slowly increase that engagement by multiplying and dividing each panel, creating more intricate and complex approaches to the challenges of storytelling in limited spaces. And of course, once you get used to a lot of these panels, you start incorporating inset panels. You start incorporating some vertical transitions, and even keeping in mind the time and the direction of your panels, having silent panels that don't necessarily need to be incorporated into the directional order of the page. In terms of the reading of this, this is Hawkeye by Matt Frashin and AHA. Looking at these 5 panels in this area, here, actually I could do this for all of you at home. Incorporating these 5 panels, this isn't a layout that is incredibly readable based on the structure alone, but due to the fact that we have these numbered panels, 1, 2, 3, and these are also silent panels, suddenly we're able to get a series of events that come together through that conversation. This is happening at the same time. These are almost functioning as word balloons. I think that the silent panel can also create just an interesting dynamic because it doesn't necessarily need to be in a specific place. We just understand the order of operations and put it together in our minds. You're given a little bit of leeway and relying more on your reader's engagement with your work rather than yourself controlling the flow of the story. I mean, you're still in control, but you get what I'm saying. And I just wanted to highlight some different, like rare exceptions to the basic structure showing that you can use elongated panels. This is Multiverse by Grant Morrison and Frank Quietly. And when we talked about elongated panels, Frank Quietly ended up dividing the panels into 8-panel grid, but not focusing on the grid that I was talking about with 6 to 8 panels, but focusing on primarily vertical grids. And being able to tell these stories by breaking up the time frames and allowing for people to walk through through singular spaces, or even allow for us to get a full landscape as people kind of navigate it, is an interesting approach to a challenge. And also the vertical panels are an interesting approach to text distribution. And considering larger dimensions. I always love European books because they use larger, since they have larger books, they're allowed to do certain things in terms of font sizes, in terms of page sizes, and what you could do with that physical page is different. I remember there being a Tintin digest that came out several years ago, and it was so difficult to read because the text couldn't be read at manga size, because it was translated from a French text to a smaller text. So remembering how you want to print this, what size it's going to end up being, is going to affect the way that you navigate managing the amount of space that you have in your comic. And I also wanted to make sure to touch on the fact you can always use your text as the guiding element rather than using panels. I don't want to ignore my panelist comics. I do love my panelist comics. And I wanted to just take a moment and acknowledge that. And, all right, cool. I have a quick moment to do this. I wanted to touch on one thing that has come up a lot in conversation around page layout, which is specifically manga traditions. It's not just about right to left, though that's a part of it. It's about top to bottom as well. I'm very limited in my scope. I wish my sources are just specific researchers and a couple of brief discussions. And I cannot claim to be an expert on manga and the approach to manga page layouts. But what I can say is that there is a larger cultural relevance to the relationship with the way those pages are laid out and the broader culture as a whole. One being specifically looking at the use of vertical text versus horizontal text. And the reason why I bring this up is I want to highlight, even though I can't go through each step of how a lot of these traditions come into play, a lot of these are based on larger traditions of comics for the past 200 or longer years of visual text relationships, imagery text relationships. But just highlighting the fact that even though things seem organic because we have grown up with them, they come from a different space. The rule of T's being able going left and down versus going right and left, comparing the text, the panel orders of these bottom two, and some of the vertical breaks in a comic. It's not just about switching from, just flipping a comic, which is the danger of like the first print of Akira, but it's about actively knowing the details and the way that these languages are structured and contribute to a broader conversation and functionality. So if I were to take a manga and add, because this is basically what they do. They take a manga and they translate it. And the reason why those word balloons are all vertical, look at stylistically, you might feel like it's really natural to just put your text square in the middle and have this space and this space just kind of like wide open. Because if you've grown up with that being the text you were reading, that might seem organic. But the fact is that this word balloon would have been filled from top to bottom. And the vertical word balloons are about the language and the way that they're initially printed. If you were to actually translate it, you would have to take some of the pillars of text and switch it so that they weren't vertically framing any of the images, but they would be horizontally framing a lot of the images. Now, I think that there's an aesthetic and there's an interesting thing that I think is worth investigating and seeing where it goes. But as far as the reason why there are stutters and gaps, seemingly, I believe that something lost in translation. In the methodology behind why things are made the way they are, once we understand that, we could either modify it, we could explore it, or we could take that into account. And that's something that I definitely wanted to touch on, whether it's the size of European comics publishing, or it's the framing of manga and Japanese text. And with that, are there any questions?
I have one from the internet. Encourage me, this is from JP Calais. Are you able to enjoy a comic or graphic novel without the artist or teacher and you breaking them down?
Yes, I'm actively able to enjoy it. I think it comes down to being able to look at something critically. It's I think there are these moments that you're like, I don't like that, but I don't know why. Me being able to look at a piece of media and know why I don't like it, it helps me. It helps me cope. But I can still consume media and enjoy it. And even certain things I will like for no good reason. Like I love a lot of bad media, especially like horror films, like a lot of bad media that aren't necessarily super effective at storytelling or whatever, but they still serve some function for me. But that's a personal, I know it's a personal relationship, and I don't believe in objective good. It's all subjective. I still enjoy it. I still like it. Yes. The
How might you translate that to like a printed format?
It's rough. You consider it as you're drawing it. Unfortunately, that's the best I could come to. It's short of that or doing a full recompositioning of it. It's sort of like saying I did my entire webcomic in 72 DPI
how do I get that to be at 300 DPI? I'm gonna be like, ooh, I got some bad news for you. But I do think that there is something to be said about the infinite scroll and the relationship of composing works for digital devices. When I work with hyperallergics, it's primarily through the infinite scroll. And so my work being seen on digital devices limits me in terms of sizing of my text and the amount that I could fit on a single page. And so reading something on your phone, you're gonna have less space. Here, I'll just do that. Reading something on your phone, you're gonna have less space than you are going to have on a page. And even at this point, when they have the comicsology switching from panel to panel, you realize there are certain limitations, and one could probably draw around those. But those are just things that we have to kind of explore and consider. I find that text size affects the way that I approach writing for infinite scrolls. And I don't, like, actively 100% do not consider printing later on, and I'm kind of regretting that a little bit. Like, it was because it was an outward publication. I'm like, they could do what they want with it. But now I'm starting to get options, and I'm like, ooh, I could do something. And so probably always consider the possibility of printing. You could also consider non-normative printing standards, but that'll be a pain once you get to it. Any other questions? Oh, how do I get to, oh, there we go. All right. Do you think there are any trends over time? Are we using more or less panels now than we used to? I feel like I'm especially biased being a teacher of comics. I feel like there are a lot of panels. I think there are trends. Even mentioning scroll comics, you might choose less panels because you need less panels. There are, I remember there was a period of time where every comic seemed to focus heavily on cinematic horizontal panels. And that was just aesthetically, everything was intended to look like a massive production in a film rather than comics. Even though like Jay Lee's work on Stephen King's, I want to say Dark Towers. Dark Towers is gorgeous, an amazing story. It is all horizontal panels, and they have a huge cinematic effect, even in the color palette. And so I think those trends do show up. And honestly, I don't really butt trends. Sometimes it's just fun. Ride a trend, see what happens. Throw some blue and orange on it. You know what I mean? But yes, I certainly do think that trends come up, and just don't feel. I'd say as an artist, you shouldn't feel limited to your trends, but also you shouldn't feel an obligation toward originality. Just find a place that you're having fun and enjoying yourself, and really explore that. These structures are vehicles that get you where you need to go in, and they help you organize your idea. It's just like writing with punctuation. You could do some wild E.E. Cummins stuff, but like you probably want to learn the basics of how to tell a poem before you start really playing with the punctuations. Yes.
So you showed that Frank Whiteley page from Multiversity, and then there's J.H. Williams page. And when I look at pages like that, a lot of times it seems like it's a really cool layout, but I wonder if it serves the storytelling well. And I wonder, what do you think? Like in terms of like, does a reader understand what's happening pretty easily, or is this just kind of showing off?
Okay, so I think showing off is a special word, or a special two words, because I would say that this is virtue signaling. This is talking to a very specific community of reader and engaging with a very specific subject matter. Specifically in this title, Grant Morrison had taken all the Charlton characters and repurposed them through this narrative that required an 8-grid panel. So it's a direct comment on Watchmen. But it only comments on Watchmen through these certain like visual cues. And so is this showing off? I feel like it's commenting, critiquing, and conversing with another title through pushing a very specific aesthetic. Yeah, I can't say if it's positive or negative, but it's definitely commenting on Watchmen and that dogmatic approach to creating the grid. Yes.
I have one. Oh, no, man, I'll bring it to you.
Okay.
So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the scripting process for yourself. I know you touched on it a little bit, but I was kind of wondering, like, when you're scripting, do the page layouts like come very naturally, like at the same time that like the words are coming? Like, is that sort of like a process that is symbiotic, or?
It's more about text and performance. I write scripts. Every comics artist I know has different script writing. Every comics writer I know writes scripts differently. A lot of my scripts are structured in their final approach. They look like stage plays, kind of, just because it's easier for people to read. And I know that I've talked to like different like people who just want to do comics and want to make comics, the agents and publishers, and they just don't want to read a script. And so I made it very simple for them to read. But the way that I approach writing it, I have a tendency to commit to a specific panel count, and everything that I do, I write, the page has a specific goal, and I have to at least like the maximum amount of panels already set, but I could always do less. And as I do less, I go back to that initial count, and either I drop panels or I create beats in the page that allow for characters to breathe and other story elements that may not have been very much on the surface to bleed through. And so it allows for me to maintain a page count, and whenever I could get some artsy stuff in, I could squeeze it in. Hopefully that was helpful. Jersey, was that
I have a question from the internet. This comes from Wes Moldash. What are the driving influences for American comic formats? Is there data that shows that American like the 6x9 format or close to it? Or is it the preference of sellers? In other words, why can't we have super big comics like the Europeans?
do you know, I think this is more of a publisher question. As far as book sizes, as far as book covers, as far as book designs, even as I look outside of comics, it seems like standardized printing is a commitment, whether it's about getting a specific size to be on a library shelf or on at a bookstore, or just something that is in some algorithm that sells better. I'm not 100% sure. I do know that when it comes to someone like Chris Ware, who doesn't have two books that are the same size, I can personally say it makes it impossible to own a bookshelf. Jeff, what's up?
Great. I'll jump in on that question. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. It is for sure, the reason the books are standardized is because of the sellers. It's the shelves, it's the way they sell them. If you go off that, it makes it hard for a comic book shop, or even somebody who runs an Amazon, not Amazon, but Barnes and Noble or something. They need it to be a standard thing that fits on a shelf. And if you buck that, then people are less likely to buy the book. And I know because I make different size books.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even just the goals of being on an end cap one day. If anyone has dreams of being on an end cap one day, you're gonna have to conform a bit. Any other questions? All right. Oh, actually, you're absolutely right. I think that there are several chats and several questions. This is how I'm going to check back at this. Okay, cool. Let me jump in the chats. Oh, those are all questions. All right. All right. If you have any comments, questions, please put those. There we go. Okay. Sorry, wrong one. Are there any new trends? Okay, I've already answered these in the chat. Are there any new trends in layouts due to online comics and platforms like Instagram for delivery? I would say that it's been a rough year in terms of me keeping up with new titles. So I'm not actually completely aware of any new trends in comics as far as 2020 goes, or 2021 goes. That is something that I will have to investigate in the future. Sorry. Any thoughts on the square page format? Ooh, I actually like the square page format. I have this desire to look at this camera like it's the internet. Oh my gosh, this is what online teaching has done to me. I look directly at the camera. The square book format I think works really well. I think there was this book, it's like Co-op or something like, or Coin-Op that came out in like these record blocks. And it was fantastic. It's a great format for carrying boxing. And also I like records. I love squares. But I do think that they're great for creating smaller square grids. And so when it comes to that 2x2 size, like American Born Chinese should have been a square book. I'm imagining that the book format was the issue, but I do like the square format. I haven't seen it in too many major publishers, usually indie books and independent presses. And let's scroll down just a little bit more. Okay, okay, there we go. Yeah. All right, any more questions? All right.
Please join me in thanking CM Campbell.
Thank you so much.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. So for everyone who's here in person, CM is going to be selling and signing books right outside of the Eisner Room. For those of you watching from home or from your offices or wherever you are out there, thank you so much for tuning in. There's about a 10-minute break before the next programs start virtually, which are at noon. Elsa Chartier, I'm going to mess that up, in conversation with Matt Fraction, and Spotlight on the animator Aaron Cosgrove. So those are streaming at noon, and then we'll be back here in the Eisner Room at the Billy Island at 2 p.m. for From Boom to Snap, an often raucous history of sound effects in comics with Kate Clopton. Thank you.
I'll come back to that. Okay. What's this for? Oh, yeah, for outside. Oh, yes, yes. I was like, oh, you're handing me Sharpies.